appease Konoha. She'd later trust with this man, and how had he repaid her? By tossing her aside. There was so much anger in those orbs, though whether it was directed at him or the Kazuki-age, he knew not. Only that he had to make a decision. Now. Here and now, before the Kazuki-age lost his patience. Out of curiosity, what would happen if I refuse these terms? Then I'm afraid our alliance is null and void. Kazuyama's tone brooked no further argument. Naruto hissed in a sharp intake of breath. In that case, he began, the words were acid in his throat, Kazuma. Naruto was almost grateful when the door slammed open, cutting off whatever he might have said. And Aide all but flung himself into the room, bespectacled face so fraught with terror that Kazuki-age didn't even deign to strike him down on the spot. Hirasama has been kidnapped in the town square. Aw, damn it. Naruto muttered. Why is this shit never easy? The Kura was already gone, darting out a window before anyone could say she wasn't needed. By all means, chase after her. The Kazuki-age urged, but the words were empty, merely a formality. It would be horrible if something were to happen to him. Swearing, Naruto lunged out into the village after her. In the shadows of his hat, a small smile twisted at the Kazuki-age's face. Hey. Are you alright? The Kura resolved herself not to speak as they flitted across the rooftops, not to look at the Uchiha for fear of revealing her emotions. Her tears. To display emotion was a weakness. One that could be exploited. Just as she had been. If her Kazuki-age, the man in whom she had laid all her hopes and dreams, was willing to ransom her off to Konoha for the sake of peace. Whom could she trust? The Uchiha. He seemed a nice enough fellow, or at least one hesitant about claiming her body like some prize cut of meat. Hey. The Kura cried out in surprise as he moved to block her with his body, forcibly arresting her movement by grabbing her wrist. This close she was suddenly aware of just how tall he was head and shoulders above her. Not just in terms of height, but skill as well. He wasn't ruffled in the slightest, and yet here she was, nearly a sobbing wreck at the Kazuki-age's betrayal. Because that was what it was. Wasn't it? He'd all but signed her death warrant by giving her to the Uchiha, uprooting her from the life that she'd known all this time. And she'd wanted to kill him for it. If that aide hadn't come barging in when he had, she would have thrown herself at the sandaime, deciding to die at the edge of his iron sand rather than become someone's trophy. I said, are you alright? Alright. She whispered brokenly into his chest, how can I be alright? She felt like an idiot. Ready to weep into the chest of a stranger she barely knew. Forced to be a wife to a man she'd just met. He had struck her true interest, but that had been when she thought she had a choice not to arrange marriage for the sake of her village. Even knowing that many before her had done the same wasn't enough to mend her heart as it were, she could only flounder in disbelief at what had been wrested away from her. You can cry if you want. I will not. She struggled out of his grasp, surprisingly he let her go. I am a Kunoichi. Almost immediately she withdrew, rubbing at her wrist. I would never shed such tears. Boy, you were just sold out by your leader. It's alright to be a bit upset. I am not upset. She all but shrieked, that was a lie, and Pakura knew it. She was distraught. You don't know me. No, but I'd like to. Like to fuck me, you mean? She remarked bitterly. Something in his eyes hardened then. No. I mean I'd like to get to know an admirable Kunoichi who deserves better than that scum of a cage. Mere words. She snapped back, but her voice warbled on the last note. Empty of promise. I could always kill him. Onyx snapped into scarlet in dire warning. No one would know. No one but her. Though he had hurt her, she was still a Kunoichi, through and through. She would do as she was told. But that didn't mean she had to reveal Naruto's threat just now, did it? You really do deserve better than him. Insufferable man. He just wouldn't let it drop, would he? And how would you know? I've seen his type before. In that instant he seemed to age before her eyes. Not in the physical sense, but more in the spiritual sense. It was all in his eyes, they looked so tired, like he had lived for far too long, and a part of him had given up and was just waiting to die. It was enough to shock whatever wariness she'd had for him right out of Pakura. This man had lived through countless horrors in his life, and yet he was still trying, despite her best efforts, to wrest her out of this impossible situation. You really have, haven't you? More than you know. The Kura looked at him then, the movement causing her intricate sunset and jade-colored bangs to form the hint of a shroud around her face. His Sharingan seemed to blur in the morning's light. Naruto couldn't miss it, and his expression reflected his intrigue. Pakura tilted her head to the right, then swayed it back left, and Naruto blinked in amazement. In the women's movement, his own eyes seemed to dance. And with Naruto still obviously mesmerized, Pakura leaned forward and quite softly brushed her lips with his own. It took several heartbeats, but that seemed to break the spell, and the Uchiha leaned away, staring at her with puzzlement. Why did you do that? He asked in a voice that seemed hard to find. Because I believe you. She whispered. Naruto cocked his head curiously, and when he started to protest, Pakura put a finger over his lips to silence him. Don't be a fool, she said with a small, sad smile. I'm not worth throwing your career away. This is why I hate village politics. Naruto muttered, scarlet orbs fading back to black. Always screwing everything up. Come on, we've got a brat to save. Reluctantly she took off after him, descending into the streets below. What was the just now? What had made her kiss him? She didn't know and likely wouldn't for many more days. No point in puzzling it out now. Not when the future Kazukiage was in danger. There he is. Naruto skidded to a dead halt when he saw the shinobi in the town square. It was obviously one of Gari's men, as if the apocalyptic rage that knotted the man's face wasn't enough, the burns answered all his questions almost immediately. What it did not answer was how in the hell the man had managed to incapacitate Hiro and Asuna Kunoichi by himself, let alone wreathe his body in enough explosive tags to blow a Milady crater in Sunagakur. Insanity didn't even begin to define this man. He glanced furtively every which way, the look in his eye was one of sheer madness, someone who had nothing left to lose but his own life. But if he lost it, so would many. You. The man raged the moment he laid eyes upon Naruto. Keep your eyes away from me. Demon. Monster. Murderer. You killed my captain. Scum. Filth. Konoha won't live to regret your actions. The prone forms of the hero and the Kunoichi offered no resistance, it was up to them to do something. Calm down, Bakura interjected with a calmness she no longer felt. How could she after what she'd just done? What are your demands? We can talk about this. Talk, he screeched. There's nothing to talk about, Suna bitch. You whores are just as bad as them. You murdered us like pigs. Butcher us. Like cattle. Now, I'm going to do the same to you. Clutching Hiro and the girl closer to himself, he cackled madly. Hell. I'll take you all to hell with me. We can all burn together. Just like he burned me. You're insane. Naruto frowned. And you need treatment. Don't touch me. The man flinched aside as Naruto's Sharingan spun into existence. Don't even look at me. I know your tricks. He told me all about them. I won't be deceived. Naruto froze, blood turning to ice in his veins. The true Uchiha. The man was raving now, clearly crazed, or so everyone seemed to think. He restored my body. Told me the truth. Send me here to kill you, traitor. And I will. Ladar, how the hell is that even possible? That was when Hiro's gold dust smashed into his face with all the force of a sledgehammer. Whatever the Iwanina had been about to say ended then and Therahis' mouth was suddenly flooded with so much of the stuff that he may well have choked on it. And given a few more seconds, he just might have. But they didn't have a few seconds. Even as the future Kazukiage wrenched himself free, the man released the kill switch, setting dozens upon dozens of aflame. Everyone fled or ran in that awful instant, all save the 4 shinobi for whom his wrath was reserved. His temper inflamed beyond all point of salvaging, the man reached down to ignite the rest of the tags strapped to his body. With his mission having failed, he was determined to at least take a few of them with him. For the glory of Iwa and his Tsuchikage, he would purge these scum. Die. There was no time to decide, he could only save one. Not both. So he grabbed the girl instead of the boy and dove for cover. In that instant he was vaguely aware of Hiro's cry of shock, then of Bakura, flinging a fireball into the man's chest with devastating effect. But it was already too late. Naruto saw with his Sharingan what would happen an instant before it occurred and reacted, calling upon a deadly power he daren't have touched until this very moment. An azure rib cage formed out of the nothing, blue bone breaking into the beginnings of a shoulder, then an arm, an elbow. Then came the explosion and orange fury burns the world white. The incomplete Susanoo served its purpose, acting as a buffer between the three of them and the blast. The Uchiha groaned as he dusted himself off, the grit and gravel of Sunagakur already etched into his uniform. A suicide bomber. Who the hell did that anymore? Still bemoaning the dirt and dust that had gotten into his immaculate uniform, the former Uzumaki turned to face the girl he'd just rescued from certain death. The same could not be said of her companion, however. Without the flying thunder god Techniquicus, this body of his he simply wasn't fast enough to save both. Whomever Hiro had been or had been destined to be, he was dead now. Dead as dead could possibly be. Well, he muttered to himself, that could have gone off better. Agreed, his colleague muttered beside him, brushing herself off with a groan. Her scorch release had been key in defusing the blast, though she was far too humble to ever admit it. Though I had not expected him to detonate himself in such a spectacular fashion. Her hazel eyes quietly regarded the small crater that had once been the market district. It would have been far larger had she not managed to detonate some of those tags prematurely. The Iwagakure assassin had only managed to take 2 lives instead of dozens. His own. And that of a shinobi. Any injuries? He asked. Here, I can heal. Bakura started, brushing off his hand with a flush. I would rather you attend to the Kunoichi beneath you, Uchiha. Wow. The teenager they'd rescued managed groaned, dusting herself off with a pained hiss. Wah. Where's? She took one look at her companion's charred corpse and turned bone white. Oh my god. Hey, Naruto patted the girl's face back to him. He knew well enough that if he gave her a chance to stare over long at her comrade's corpse, the poor girl would just break down. Don't look at him. Look at me. Are you alright? Are you injured? What's your name? The trick was to bombard them with so many questions that they didn't have time to think there would be time to grieve later. If there was even the slightest of possibilities that the attacker wasn't acting alone. Her voice was numb, though thankfully not with shock. Carrera. Rank. Junin. Injuries. None. Measurements. Ha. Kidding. He sighed, if she had enough energy to be angry, then she'd be just fine. Right then, Kururichan, I need you to focus. Can you stand? Hi. Naruto froze as he helped her up, as he got a good look at her, realization swarming over him. Brown hair. Purple eyes. Merciful Kami above and Yami below. This was no mere Kunoichi in his arms, he'd just saved Gaara's mother from certain death. And if that boy with the gold dust was who he thought he was, then that blackened body had to be Gaara's father. That was who Hiro was. No other shinobi wielded such a technique, and if they did, he didn't know of them. Meaning. Bulls. What the hell happened here? Naruto didn't even look up as Tsunade's voice pierced the air above him. Jiraiya and Orochimaru arrived soon thereafter, pausing only to gawp at the massive hole the man had punched in the village, before bringing their attention to bear upon Naruto. In the end it was the latter, not the former, who asked the million-dollar question. What did you do? Naruto took one long look at Pakura, then Kurara, and sighed. Yeah, kind of a long story there. Aim. Naruto's deadpan was barely concealed. You give me a team, and the first thing you do is send me to aim. I wish it were otherwise, but you have proven yourself too capable. Hiruzen replied, steepling his fingers. Your actions in Suna garnered a great deal of attention after all. He made no mention of Pakura and Kurara, that went without saying that Naruto had made a coup by securing the two Kunoichi of Konoha, regardless of what some might think. So what's the mission? Rank, as matter of fact. And? Naruto pressed. Sarutobi continued. Hanzo's been making trouble along the border for too long now and needs to be dealt with. I've already sent Urayakin and the others ahead. If you hurry you should be able to catch up with them. Besides, these three are quite capable, as I'm sure you'll see. I'm sure they'll become Chunin in no time. Naruto's only response was to pinch the brow of his nose. Lem guess, I have no say in this whatsoever. None at all. Now see for yourself. As if on cue, a soft knock sounded on the door. Ah, there they are now. Come in. Two youths entered, closing the door behind them. I would like you to meet your team. Naruto's brow furrowed as he beheld the three youths assembled before him by Sarutobi. He'd fought and railed against this from the moment he'd set foot back in Konoha, but in the end cooler heads had prevailed. So here he was in the old man's office, silently ruining his new rank as Jonin. He recognized a young Kurenai Yuhi almost Imidaya-Teltha's ruby red eyes were a dead giveaway. The boy, he didn't know. He had silver hair like Kakashi, but there was no way it was his old sensei. Kakashi was still a kid in the academy if he recalled correctly. It wasn't until Sarutobi identified him as Ibiki Marino that he actually got a rise out of Naruto. Oh, this was rich. These two had scared the crap out of him when he was a kid, but now the tables were turned. Speaking of tables, where was the third student? Sarutobi seemed to realize it as well. Where is Uzumaki Kushina? He asked. Naruto's head snapped around so quick it might have flown clear off his neck. Somewhere in the back of his mind, his darker half cackled. Naruto only had one word for them both. No. Yes. Hiruzen answered immediately, ignoring the killing intent that flooded the room. She hasn't had a sensei since her last one died in action a year ago. As she seems quite attached to you, I deemed it fitting. She's too old. A genin is a genin. The Sandaime remained unmoved by his plight. Besides, and here he did become closer, you're one of the few shinobi who can control her, should it attempt to breach the seal again. I trust you will treat this matter with the utmost discretion. Before Naruto could answer, a voice was heard from beyond the door. Those fools weren't arm wrestling, they were playing live deathmatch tebane. Hi. One of the Anbu answered. Go right on in. Instead of opening slowly, the door flung itself open with a resounding crash. Admitting a blur of orange and black. Uzumaki Kushina, reporting for Tatiga Naruto. She skidded to a grinding halt, eyes wide at the sight of him. When did you get back from your mission? Yo. Just a few hours ago. The Uchiha colored at the sight of the girl. Beautiful as ever, her long, lustrous red hair trailing after her loud entrance. Strapped proudly to her forehead. And was she wearing? Orange. It was almost enough to draw a smile to his face, the sight of his favorite color, stirring up fond memories deep within his heart. Still, the scowl refused to depart from his face. Sarutobi's next words only deepened it. Meet your new sensei, Kushina. Her grin was practically ear-splitting. And bloody adorable, he had to admit. Sensei. Ons. In hindsight, their return trip was surprisingly peaceful, considering all Naruto and Co. had gone through. After the chaos ensued in the town square, it was quietly decided that it would best serve the interests of both parties if Konoha signed the treaty and departed post-haste. A tactical retreat to avoid further casualties, the Suna Council had called it. The Kazuki age had been less subtle, Hiro's corpse was still cooling, the ink still drying on the dotted line, and already Sasori had been chosen as the man's given successor. Now that he'd gotten what he wanted, he was all too eager to see the back of them. The kunoichi would be given to the Leaf, as per the terms of the treaty, and in return the larger village would honor its ties with Sand for all time. Kind words were spoken and promises given, but they left Naruto feeling soiled inside nonetheless. And how could they not? Orochimaru of all people had been the one to talk him into formally accepting the terms, since the Kazuki had refused to honor their peace in any other suit. He was loath to admit it, but the slippery snake had a point, sometimes you had to put aside what you wanted for the sake of the greater good. Jiraiya of course had been all for it, of course. Some things never changed. Tsunade was oddly morose about it, though. The Kura had been silent as the grave ever since they'd left the gates, in contrast, Kurura seemed almost grateful for the Sandame's decree. Despite the fact that the man had non-editedly berated her for even being kidnapped in the first place, she had been called weak, worthless, and not fitting to be a kunoichi. Of course she was grateful to be gone. Not that Naruto blamed her. Ara's mother struck him as the gentle sort, and her unease in the presence of her own cage spoke volumes for the girl's character. She was a gentle soul, couldn't hurt a fly if she tried. Relatively speaking. Tai. Sorry. Kurura whispered contritely as she continued to trim his hair. Did I get you? A little, yeah. Ow. Careful, girl. Omen. Naruto yelped as the scissors missed his hair and accidentally nipped a chunk out of his ear. His cry was met by muffled snorts of laughter from the others, mounted once more upon the mighty Manda's head, the large snake ferrying them across the desert twice in less than 2 days. With no sandstorm or shinobi to deter them, their odd little group was making surprising progress. Naruto, finally making the opportunity, had decided to cut his hair, the long locks have been singed during the suicide bomber's last blast. Long locks were useful for shinobi like Jiraiya, who hardened their hair into spikes and flailed it around, but Naruto saw it as more of an impediment than anything else. The last thing he wanted was someone grabbing a handful of it again as they had during the ambush. So he was getting a trim, courtesy of Kurura. He was keeping them bangs and a good portion of it though couldn't ditch the resemblance entirely. Perhaps you should let me try, Naruto-sama. Kurura asked, the ghost of a smile flitting across her face. Granted, it was a pale imitation of the real thing, but nevertheless her very first display of outward emotion since they'd left Suna behind them. She'd clung to him like a second shadow since the explosion, though thankfully she hadn't been untoward in her displays of devotion since their kiss. If it could even be called such. More and more Uchiha Uzumaki Naruto found himself surrounded by beautiful women with no idea what to do with them. Oh, he knew what he could do, but his chivalry held that urge firmly in check. Somewhat. Kinda. Sort of. Oh, who the hell was he kidding? He'd wanted to screw Pakura silly for at least an hour, and it didn't help that she kept brushing up against him. Haha, maybe that would be for the best. Very well. But when the older kunoichi tried to claim the scissors, Kurura clutched them to her chest. Was I really that bad? One look from the poor made Naruto think he'd just killed her puppy or something. Gah. Not the puppy eyes no jutsu, the bane of man's existence everywhere. Did all women know that technique? Not even he could last more than 5 seconds under that stare. Perhaps he was simply too chivalrous, because he folded like wet tissue paper. Let her do it. Naruto almost groaned, pitying the way his poor head was going to look after this. Laura's smile made up for that, if only a fraction. God, what was he going to do with her? Tsunade shook her head to that effect, completely unaware of the conflict roiling within the young man's skull. You big baby. You can fling fireballs until you're out of breath, but when she tries to cut your hair. Not my fault, alright, I never liked getting my hair cut. Besides, I'm ticklish. Not a lie, his neck had always been very sensitive, Sakura had enjoyed tormenting him there during their brief relationship. There it was again, that dull ache reminding him of the one woman he'd failed to save. The only woman. He might have moved on in this day and age, but a part of her would always be with him. A hand on his shoulder, urging his feet onward, reminding him why he was doing this. Never again, he would tell himself whenever he saw someone in need, be they kunoichi or shinobi, someone whose life he could waltz from the misfortune that had befallen them in this time. Never, ever again. He knew he couldn't save everyone, but he'd be damned if he didn't try to save someone. So that's why he's never cut it. Orochimaru mused. Kid, Jiraiya grumbled at that one, I don't know whether to be jealous or just pity you. Leave him be, Jiraiya. The paler of the pair was quick to admonish his comrade for the slip. I, for one, see the advantage of having 2 foreign kunoichi under our roof. It will strengthen ties with the village. Naruto would have shook his head in amazement had he not been writhing in discomfort. Orochimaru backing him up. Was the world coming to an end? Still though, that was one way to think of it. If said Kunoichi hadn't already fallen head over heels for him. A tick mark appeared over the blonde's forehead. Ticklish, eh? Yuho. Kurorichan. She began sweetly. Naruto froze, instantly on guard whenever she used that tone of voice. Hi. Can I borrow those for a second? The Uchiha bristled the moment she handed them over, Sharingan flaring. Oh don't you dare. Wah, afraid of a little snip. Tsunade edged closer, clearly enjoying his discomfort. Naruto's gaze snapped to Pakura and Karara, seeking aid. But the two Kunoichi were smiling, silently bemused that their savior was so terrified by the prospect of the scissor-wielding woman. Jiraiya and Orochimaru weren't of any help either, both men seemed content to observe his mad scramble to safety, skittering backward like a drunken crab in a desperate attempt to escape the blonde. I'm warning you. C''M now, I'm not gonna hurt you. Much. Lem go, woman. Enjoy the haircut, Jiraiya snickered. Naruto yelped as Tsunade tightened her hold of him and mercilessly descended with the scissors. One haphazard haircut later. Are you still sulking about that? Come on kid, are you really going to give me the silent treatment? Leave him be. Jiraiya muttered, quietly poking at the fire with a stick. He'll open up when he's good and ready. Unfortunately Tsunade seemed to think good and ready meant good and now, because she refused to let the matter drop. If there was one thing she loathed above all else it was being ignored. And the Uchiha was doing just that, stubbornly resisting all attempts to coax him out of his self-inflicted depression. Not that he could be blamed of course, after the horrendous haircut she'd given him. Come on, damn it. Talk to me. Lem be. Naruto's voice resounded in kind, spoken as though from a great distance. You hacked a huge chunk out of it. Crazy woman. What was that? You did mess up his hair pretty badly. Orochimaru pointed out drolly. But I'm never giving you scissors again. Karura shook her head in mock disbelief. To think someone could be so poor at cutting hair. That's not. Should have let me do it. Added Pakura. Poor Tsunade, she recoiled as though she'd been stung. Were you ganging up on me? Naruto folded both arms across his chest and refused to answer the laughter that followed that statement. And even if he had deigned to speak, he probably wouldn't have been able to make himself heard over the howling winds anyways. A storm had swept up out of nowhere from the wastes, battering them with great gales and even greater gouts of sands. With night fast approaching and temperatures plummeting, their little group had been forced to seek shelter in the first. It would have been slow going indeed if they hadn't found this cave. Pakura had been the one to point it out, the Jonin's skill the sole reason they weren't out in the cold at this very moment. It was also the reason why Naruto had gone to the back of said cave, to be alone. He wasn't at all fond of what Tsunade had done to his hair. He'd get over it eventually, but for now, he wanted nothing to do with scissors or Tsunade. He wanted to sulk, and not even Karura could jostle him out of it. He'd walked as far as his legs would carry him, and here he sat until her voice finally stopped pestering him. Grungrugly. The former blonde blanched as his gut grumbled in protest. It wanted food, damn it. Even then, he willed himself not to move, waiting until he was certain the others had fallen asleep. His stomach growled again at this, rumbling in angry betrayal. He couldn't very well last a night without some sort of sustenance now, could he? With that in mind, he started to rise, intent on filching. That was when his foot caught on something, sending him stumbling into a wall. Fucking ouch. What in the world? Frowning, he bent to inspect it. Black eyes bulged. Corpse. For it was indeed just that, a mummified man. His skin stretched taut over dead bones, eyes long once withered and gone, his face frozen in his last moments. Whatever had killed him, it must have been agonizing to produce an expression like that. But what was this? Just leave the fucker be and get some food. His darker half grumbled. I'm fucking starving here, man. But Naruto was intrigued. The dead man bore a kumagakure, his emaciated body suggesting he'd been here for a good long while. A few decades, at least, if this withered husk was any indication. More or less as a precaution, he chose to frisk the man to see if he had any supplies on him. One had to be practical during war, after all. He'd been expecting kunai. Shuriken. Your old supplies have gone bad. What he got was a large and excolored roll of parchment bound to the man's back. Naruto studied the scroll for a long moment, quietly marveling at what he had found. It was indeed a large scroll, almost as large as the toad summoning scroll Jiraiya had once shown him. That, or some kind of scroll meant to store items. Surely this couldn't be such a thing. Could it? No, this looked more like a aha. Breaking the seal that bound it, his suspicions were confirmed. A summoning contract. But not just any mere contract. This was a contract by which he could summon a beast as legendary as it was mythical. Dragons. He felt his fingers tremble at the thought and fought the urge to put it back. He wasn't aware such a pact had existed, and indeed if it had most likely been lost in this cavern to the ages. No one had stumbled upon an old corpse in this time, no one had thought to search through his belongings. No one knew of this. No one. Except him. Holy shit. Yami was practically bouncing with glee inside his head. This is great. No, this is beyond great. Oi. Do you have any idea what we could do with this? We'll have the village kissing our feet. Naruto said nothing to that idea, instead relieving himself to inspect the scroll more closely. If something is too good to be true. It often is. But despite his reservation and an exhaustive inspection, this scroll was every bit as legitimate as it seemed. Detailed within this worn parchment were a series of signatures, their names too worn to even partially decipher. This scroll wasn't just old. It was ancient. Whomever this man had been, he must have been of a rare breed indeed. The things this man must have seen. Stop dawdling and sign it. Odd, you don't have to shout. Nipping a thumb, he carefully wrote his name in blood. Uchiha Naruto. He had expected the scroll to reject him outright for using a fake name, but it accepted him without complaint, his signature appearing at the end of that long and lengthy list. His thumb healed almost immediately, it seemed such a small wound wasn't beyond Kyuubi's impaired ability to heal. Despite his own curiosity however, trying to summon such a beast in this enclosed space was nothing short of foolish. He'd wait until later to attempt such a feat. Closing it, he opened a storage scroll and sealed it away. Wouldn't do to have his friends learn of his new discovery before he'd master it now, would it? Whomever this man was, whomever he had been, he clearly didn't have a use for it anymore. That didn't make him feel any less of a grave robber, though. And Iwa might be enemies of Konoha in this war, but they'd also been their allies in the past. And here he was, picking a corpse apart. So much for nobility. What have you got there? Jesus Matha. Naruto nearly started out of his skin as Bakura's voice snaked into his ear. She seemed to materialize from the gloom like a ghost, one moment she wasn't there and the next she was, cradling a swirling sphere of pale fire in the palm of her hand. Despite himself, the Uchiha actually gulped. Damn thing was downright eerie. Her pale skin seemed to shimmer in the dim light, her hazel eyes dancing with the crimson color of her flames. The silence seemed to stretch onto eternity between the two of them, an awkward tension broken only by the sound of their breathing. Finally, someone broke it. Scorch release. The Kunoichi explained at his questioning glare, ruefully indicating the crimson orb with a jerk of the head. Just call me a glorified human flashlight. She fell silent after that one, pointedly eyeing the spot beside him in an unspoken inquiry. Can I sit? Her gaze seemed to ask. Reluctantly Naruto slid back, acquiescing to her quiet question. She settled neatly beside him, her shoulder brushing his. For a heartbeat they remained like that, nuzzling in silence. The others are sound asleep. Naruto asked at last. Why aren't you? Bakura snorted, it was a very unladylike sound. Your friend, Jiraiya. She arched a delicate eyebrow, teasingly. He snores. Loudly. Ah. Naruto remembered that from his training days with Arasanen. It was enough to make him snicker. Glad to see you finally came out of your shell. Indeed her last two remarks had surprised him, she was being a great deal more informal with him. He liked that. Didn't want people treating him like royalty because of his name, more than anything he wanted to be treated as a regular shinobi. Albeit an extraordinarily powerful one. One who now has the legendary dragon contract. Yami popped into existence on his shoulder. Oh, the havoc we will wreak with that. Naruto quietly quashed the little devil and returned his attention to Bakura. So? Why the sudden change of heart? I've done some thinking. She shrugged. When my Kazekage told me I was to go with you, I thought of it as a curse, at first. You calling me ugly, sweetheart? He queried an eyebrow. No. Bakura shot to her feet as though she'd been burned. 1,000 pardons, Naruto Dono. Relax, I was just joking. He took her wrist and tugged her back down. Lighten up. You're making fun of me. She accused, but she used the orb in her hand to light the torch nonetheless. It burned softly at their feet, providing a touch of warmth and light as her scorching fireball faded. Maybe. But you need to loosen up a little bit. And how do you suggest I do that? She challenged me. Well, you might want to let your hair down once in a while and be sociable, you know. You and Tsunade are getting along swimmingly, but you haven't said so much as 2 words to Jiraiya or Orochimaru. One is a pervert, the other frightens me. She returned in a tone that hinted there would be no arguing on that, and any attempt to do so on his part would prove futile. Can you move closer a bit? I'm cold. Naruto compiled nevertheless, leaning into her until he could feel her even through his jacket. This close he could smell her, the faint scent of a desert lilac, rare and beautiful, yet so understandably fragile. Without thinking a hand rose and reached out to touch her hair, fingers stroking through the jaden locks, lingering at their sunset-colored tips. What? Bakura flushed. Is there something on my face? No. Do you like girls with long hair? That question caught him off guard. Long hair, huh? Naruto thought of that one moment, mentally flicking through the girls he knew who possessed such luscious locks. Hinata. Karen. May. He wasn't really opposed to long or short in any case. Eventually, he shrugged. I don't dislike them. Bakura said nothing for the longest time, twirling a strand through her fingers. Suddenly, her gaze slid to his. Would you like it if I grew mine out? I like you for who you are. Naruto frowned, not seeing the point to such a question. Even if you are a bit stiffoof. He grunted as she shoved an elbow into his stomach. That hurt. So you can feel pain after all. A demure smile pulled at her lips. And here I was beginning to think you were invulnerable. Unless scissors are involved. She chuckled softly. Naruto uttered a series of oaths so foul it made her cheeks burn before culminating in a single sentence. Shinobi don't give good haircuts. Next time, ask me to cut it. Bakura suggested. I'm no expert, but my aunt taught me a few things. Naruto bristled, thinking immediately of Tsunade's hack job, but nodded nonetheless. It wasn't as though Bakura could screw it up beyond what had already been done. I'll do that, then. At her miserable expression, he swiftly switched gears. So? You have family back home? An aunt and an uncle actually, yes. The Kunoichi warmed to the change of topic immediately, her eyes brightening with a spark of life. They're civilians, though. She's been a stylist all her life, and he, an accountant. I know it sounds silly, but they probably think of me as a hero for giving myself to Konoha as I have. Damn Kazuki-age. Naruto muttered beneath his breath. Treating his own shinobi like pawns on a chessboard. I should have killed him. I told you not to say such things. She fixed him with an intense stare. Besides, I would rather be. And here she gulped, betrothed to you and have my freedom than remain a tool in Suna. You've been wonderful to me so far. Yes. I suppose that's true. Do you have any family, though? In your village? The sorrowful knot twisted at Naruto's gut. No direct family, anyway. So you were alone before that. I had someone. Oh. Her face fell. What's she like? Thought she died a long time ago. Ah. Naruto, I'm sorry. Bakura, Onyx met Hazel, both turned aside, unsure of what to say. The air between them felt charged, as if they were both waiting for something to happen, though Naruto was sure it was just a product of his own overactive imagination. He tried to concentrate on small talk, but it felt as if something more than just words were passing between them. And when Bakura's hand suddenly lifted to cradle the juncture of his neck and shoulder, he jumped so badly their conversation came to a grinding halt, sparks skittering as he realized Bakura was touching him and looking at him with warmth and concern. You're injured. She murmured softly. Naruto blinked, reminded of the explosion back in Sunagakure. A shard of debris had smacked him in the face. Filled with adrenaline, he thought nothing of it at the time, but the mere mention of it was enough to evoke a dull ache. One that began to fade as a familiar green glow engulfed Bakura's hand. You know how to heal. It was not a question. One learns many skills in Suna. Came her even reply. I'm no medic, but I can ease the pain. Ease the pain. Was she talking about his injury or the burden he'd been bearing ever since Hiro had died? The knowledge that Gaara and his siblings no longer existed was a painful burden to bear. He'd never once considered that his presence in the past might obliterate the future of his friends. He couldn't care less what had happened to Sasuke or the fact that he'd essentially done the same by wiping his former ally from existence the moment he'd taken Mikoto. This was different. There was nothing to prevent him and Bakura from. Do you want me to ease it? He had the distinct impression she wasn't talking about the bruise anymore. Anyone with half a brain cell could see the dual meaning of those words. Their eyes met again, this time neither looked away. Please. Perhaps it was the stress. Maybe it was the unspoken tension between the two of them. It might have even been the physical movement of her hand, now cradling his face. Whatever the case, he suddenly found his lips on hers, his hand cupping her cheek and guiding her mouth to his. If his kiss with Mikoto had sparked a flame, this one ignited a raging inferno. Bakura melted into the lock of those lips with a soft sigh as though she'd been waiting for him all along. Perhaps she had. He hadn't had enough time to take stock off their kiss back in Suna. There had been so much on his mind, too much danger to even register little more than a touching of their lips. Not this time. They were soft and moist and oh so very warm, pressing against him with a tender insistence he simply couldn't bring himself to deny. It felt freeing. Wonderful. All his worries and fears fell away at once, pushed to the back of his mind by the mouth of the Kunoichi pressing against him. He didn't have a care in the world. The Kura was of a similar mind. At first his was so slow and tender that it made her want to melt into a puddle on the cavern floor. Without warning, it became hard and hungry, making her very toes curl, and her clothes threatened to fall off altogether. His hand splayed through her tightly bound hair and gently pulled the needle free, losing the verdant green tresses messily from captivity as the other tightened on the underside of her thigh, tugging her leg up a fraction to cradle his hips. She moved with him straddling her weight against his, knocking him to the floor, her lips never leaving his for an instant. He shifted against her hissing in pain as his back struck the unyielding stone. Bakura, he rasped against her mouth. His voice alone was enough to evoke a soft cracked moan in the back of her throat. She wanted him. needed him. Here was a man who didn't see her as a tool or a pawn, a piece on a chessboard to be moved forward or back or sacrificed when the need saw fit. He saw her as Kenwaichi. As a woman. She heard the way he called her name, felt it as he stroked the back of her neck, saw it in those burning black orbs, tasted it as her tongue tangled with his. It was everywhere around them, saturating the air. Perhaps that was her bloodline warming the cold stone on their backs. There was no plea to stop as his hand traced her cheek, then her neck, no demand or anger there in those words. Unbidden, she felt a spool of warmth trickle between her legs. Oh God. He was making her wet. His hand continued on its direct path down to her sternum, where it met resistance from the zipper of her dark flak vest. He began to push it down, unintentionally sending tiny needles of desires prickling at her body in swift succession. Tiny gasps fled from her mouth. Don't stop. Don't stop. Bakura was in utter bliss. Her breasts were tight and aching, demanding to be touched. Her skin felt as though the flames of her scorch release danced beneath it, virtually beyond her control, writhing and arching encouragement to the finger pushing her zipper down. She could barely control herself. It took every fiber of her being not to just tear the damn thing off and take him now. Every second he delayed was torment, every instant in which his lips were not upon hers, agony. Clearly this was less than normal. Naruto seemed to realize this the moment he'd pushed the zipper far enough to expose the valley between her breasts. He paused, considering, for an awful instant she feared he was going to back away. Bakura was left on the ground, panting from residual want and an unfulfilled aching. In a way she was relieved that he'd stopped. But the damage had already been done. If he backed off now her heart would be in pieces. She'd only just begun to trust him, and if he were to betray that trust a swift tug of his wrist savagely disabused her of such a notion. Ever so slowly he pulled his hand the rest of the way down, gently tugging it free with a flick of a wrist. His hand took up residence upon one breast, as though he owned the damn thing, kneading the flesh softly beneath his fingers. He chose that moment to take her nipple between his teeth and nip. Not gently. As fate would have it, the fraying leash Bakura had kept on her self-control, chose that moment to snap. Stop teasing me, goddammit. Not content with their new position, she grabbed him by his flak jacket and pulled him towards the floor, his hands tugging at her clothes as they went. Naruto muttered some earth jutsu beneath his breaths as they fell, simultaneously raising a wall of hardened rock to keep any unwanted eyes at bay and softening the cavern floor into a loamy bed of soil in the same instant. She saw his eyes in the dim torchlight, Sharingan dancing as she tore at his clothing and hers, his hands were equally as explorative as they struggled to eradicate all barriers between them. He pulled the remnants of her jacket. Blouse over her head and pushed her gently onto the bed, admiring the look of her naked torso in the dim light afforded by their torch. He took off his own shirt, smirking softly as her eyes danced over his chest. He leaned down and pulled her pants away, revealing a pair of briefs. He chuckled softly as he saw them, their dampness. Wow. I thought you'd be wearing a thong. Horrible. She whispered, not meaning a word of it. You're Hiraya. Her words ended in a sharp gasp as he bent to remove them with his teeth, sharp incisors deftly plucking her last article of clothing and tossing aside. Bakura had just enough time to wonder at that mischievous glint in his eyes before he lowered his mouth past her waist, down to the thatch of dark curls just above her. Naruto. She realized too late what he was about to do, and she was powerless to prevent it. She'd never had that done to her before. The sudden lash of pleasure was utterly unbearable, and her body snapped rigid with tension, unable to decide whether to push closer or pull away. Helpless little mules escaped her mouth, and her hands tugged at his hair so hard it was a wonder he didn't complain. Razor blades of pleasure tore at her heart and cut her to pieces before she could bother to protest. Bakura knew not how long his tongue stabbed and swirled at that sensitive bundle of nerves, only that when he finally ceased his ministrations, she could barely bring herself to move. That's not fair. She gasped out. Those dark eyes surveyed her with thinly veiled bemusement. You're still wearing clothes. Not fair. Well, why didn't you just say so? Naruto did just that, tossing his belt and trousers aside. The two shinobi were soon naked and Bakura straddled him, taking him in her hands as she slowly lowered herself into her lover. Bakura was by no means a virgin, but even she hesitated a moment before taking him in, and when she did, she wasn't disappointed, his length stretching her muscles just shy of their breaking point. A few quick thrusts began to push her closer and closer to that edge, then further until… That was all it took for the haze to fall over Bakura, and she came with a small cry, collapsing against him. There was a silence between the two shinobi then, broken only by their short gasps of breath. Finally Bakura turned her head to look up at Naruto, disheveled hair tickling at the nape of his neck. She laid a soft kiss upon his chin and snuggled down against him, completely content. Whole. Satisfied. Relieved. It was as if she'd been missing a piece of herself and had finally found him, here within this mysterious Uchiha. That was… wow. Naruto finished with a gasp, cradling her against him. Sex with Makoto had been amazing, but Pakura was a very close second. There had been a graceful savagery to their lovemaking, not slow and drawn out, but frantic, as though the two of them couldn't bear to do without the other. "You really should let me cut your hair," she murmured, brushing a hand through the ebony locks. "Even after what Tsunade-sama did, it just keeps growing." "Wah, you bang me once and think that gives you the right to start snipping." Naruto laughed, the words completely without rancor. "I'd like that, actually. But not too short, alright." Pakura's only reply was to nuzzle up against him. "Whatever you say. Husband." Naruto was suddenly intensely grateful that her eyes were closed because Pakura missed the flaming flush that stole over her face. Granted, the idea of being betrothed to her didn't seem so far-fetched now, but being called husband by such a drop-dead gorgeous woman. Well, he'd never expected such a thing. "You do know we aren't married yet, right?" She simply purred like a contented kitten, somehow the sound endeared her to him even more. "As long as you do it. I am yours." Neither would speak of what happened on that stormy night, although some would wonder. Why oh why were the two cuddled together the next morning? It was something of a small blessing when they finally reached the gates with most of Naruto's hair and his mind still intact. His neck felt far less strained now, the spiky ebony curtain of his hair now merely shoulder length, instead of the jagged curtain that had covered his back for most of the journey. It felt good to be able to turn his head and not get sideswiped by his own hair. Bakura really did a wonderful job on it. Now he did not so much resemble the madman from whom he was supposed to descend as he did look similar. Still, even with the haircut, sometimes he half expected to find Madara's face staring back at him for all intensive purposes, it nearly was with only a few minor differences. Taking softly to himself, he turned his gaze from the evening heavens back to the earth. Wouldn't go around smacking into trees now, would it? Now that they'd disembarked from Manda, and with the village only a stone's throw away, he almost found himself longing for the easy ride the King of Serpents had offered. Changing the future was hard work, damn it. But the prizes, man. Think of the "one more crack out of you and I'm putting ya on mute. Oh, I won't mind being quiet, considering you're about to get some. That's it. Come here." Yami retreated, slithering away with a snicker before he could pin him down. His darker half was utterly incorrigible, uncaring of the bonds of morality that had once bound them. And that was troublesome. "Naruto-sama." He turned his head as Kurura sidled up beside him, her violet eyes peering through the gloom to meet him with an eerie certainty. He remembered her remark that she was a censor type, but the way she looked at him told the Uchiha she'd known exactly what he was up to, lagging behind at the tail end of the group. Even Pakura was ahead of them, reluctantly making small talk with Uraya at the latter's behest. That was good for her, she needed to learn that the Konoha shinobi weren't her enemy. Not by any stretch. She needed to learn that this wasn't a death sentence, that there were others upon which she could rely besides him. Bakura might be special to him now, but she needed to learn to interact with others. Kurura, on the other hand, seemed more curious than afraid of her new home, judging by the inquisitive look in his eyes. "You need something?" She faltered for a moment before him with a stare so intense he almost started. Yes. What's Konoha like?" It was exactly what he needed. "Why, I'm glad you asked." For all the bad memories he'd had here, there were even more good ones. Now, some might tell you Konoha's a great village, rich with history, but the truth is. But that he launched into a grand tale of the village, both past and present. Parts of which were exaggerated of course for the sake of the story, telling her of all the sights and sounds, the best places to train, greatest eateries. Ichiraku still stood at the top of that list quite proudly. Gladly answering the occasional question offered, giving his own unbiased opinion of several clans, some of which would have started a war had they heard his words, the story finally culminating just as they reached the sentries at the gate. "And that's why you never piss off an Abiram." By the end, Kurura was positively glowing with amusement. Her frown was nowhere to be seen, if anything she seemed to have forgotten it entirely in her urge not to laugh. Needless to say, Naruto noticed. "What's so funny?" It's nothing." They shook her head, the motion sending her short tresses twirling as they ground to a halt outside the village and awaited admittance. "I just never imagined the Uchiha were like this. Powerful and arrogant, yes. But kind, too. Like you. You've actually made me feel a little bit better about leaving my home." Naruto felt something twist inside of him. "Did you leave any family back home?" "If you mean parents, no. They died a long time ago. I've been living on my own ever since. Had a distant cousin, but we never really talked. I'll admit, I was kinda interested in Hirakin, but after what happened," her expression tightened only ever so slightly. "I don't think my love life is about to take off anytime soon." "Sorry." "Damn," she'd reminded him again. "Tamari. Kankuro. Gaara. By letting Hiro die, he'd effectively killed the Sunba siblings before they were born. Yet another trio to tack onto the ever-growing list of dead. Worse, he almost couldn't bring himself to care. What did that make him? A monster for changing things, or a villain for simply shrugging off the loss of life? Would it be worth it in the end? Would he change their past? Only to sacrifice his own future his very soul in the process. Not even the Shinigami himself knew the answer to that. No, don't be. He turned, frowning as Kurura spoke up again. I'm glad you saved me and everything, it's just. This, she gestured to the gates, it's all so sudden and unexpected. I feel like I'm going to wake up at any moment and find out that I've been dreaming. Good or bad dream? Good, I think. She looked at him for a long moment, then smiled. Definitely good. For what it's worth, I didn't mean to take you out of your village like that. I'm actually glad you did. What? Her admittance rocked him to the core. She was grateful. Who was grateful to leave behind everything they'd ever known? I had no friends in Suna. Frankly, it was a miracle I made Chunin. My only skill is a talent I was born with. She touched a hand to the small gourd she kept bound at her waist. The ability to manipulate sand, for what it was worth. I'm not even sure if it's a bloodline. She swirled her hand for emphasis, uncorking the tiny container and calling forth the grains. Naruto watched, awestruck as they swirled around her fingers, obeying all her whims and actions. Your Kage is a kind man, right? Sakura's voice fell, reduced a little more than a dry whisper. Perhaps he'll find some use for me once they let us in. Naruto felt something stir in him at the sight of that sand. Her words reminded him much of Gaara before he'd become Kazekage. It hurt. Without thinking, he rounded on her. Don't talk like that. His own action's snappishness of his tone startled the both of them, his hand locking round her wrist in a vice, causing the sand to fall away from her fingers. You are not a tool. His words got a backwards glance from Pakura and a small sigh from Tsunade. You are a Kunoichi, and a splendid one at that. You are a person. You have meaning. Purpose. Don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise. See, that's what I mean. Despite the painful grasp, Kurura made no effort to shake herself free, if anything she seemed to value the contact. You treat me like I have value. Worth. The others, your clan, are they like you? One hand traced his, her small fingers drawing soft circles in his rough hand. Because if they are. Oh, no. He answered, mesmerized by the motion. I'm a special case. So you're just my knight in shining armor, That got a shy smile out of her. Thank you, Naruto-san. I appreciate the sentiment. Well, you're welcome. Naruto answered, releasing her hand, suddenly unsure. What the hell was that? For a moment there, he had almost. Oh, that's right. His head swung around as Kurura piped up once more. I wanted to give this to you. She dipped a hand into a pouch at her side and emerged with an alabaster-colored scroll, one she pushed into his waiting hands. Naruto accepted it, frowning. A scroll. Not just any scroll. She admonished me. What you have there is a summoning contract for scorpions. Suddenly the worn scroll looked like platinum in Naruto's hand. Wisely, he chose not to mention the contract he had found back in the cave. If he accepted this. But why give this to me? Wouldn't you have more use for it? It was my mother's contract. Kurura faltered briefly at his confusion. She passed it on to me in her will. Don't get me wrong, I tried to summon them a few times, but they never did accept me. So. I wanted you to have it. Her hands wrung nervously together above her stomach. For everything you've done. In that instant, Naruto couldn't put his emotions into words, his mouth failed him utterly. It wasn't just the gift, rather, it was the fact that Kurura seemed all too willing to part with it. It was clearly a painful reminder of her past, one she didn't want to be burdened with. So she'd given it to him. Humbled, he tucked it into his pouch. Many thanks, laddie. So if you're a knight, I guess that makes me a damsel in distress, then. She continued with a flushed face. Too mean, you did save my life after all. And now this. You keep praising me, and yet I've done nothing but feel sorry for myself these last 2 days. But. Hearing those words. I almost want you to praise me more. She finished in a tiny plaintive voice that made him want to sweep her into his arms and kiss all those worries away until she waswa. Naruto clamped one hand over his mouth and feigned a cough, while in reality he just barely stifled a sudden trickle of blood from his nose. Where did that come from? Naruto-san. It's nothing. He muttered, looking away. Hurt flickered across Kurura's visage for the span of 2 beats, but it may as well have been an eternity for all it seared into his brain. Mentally, he smacked himself silly for the slip. Gaara's mom, Gaara's mom. Gaara's mom. Gaara's mom. Sasuke's mother was one thing, considering he'd never liked the prick and found Mikoto to be marvelously attractive. But this was Gaara's mother. There was nothing to stop him from taking advantage of these feelings she had for him, worse, a small part of him wanted to. But he respected Gaara as a friend and a dear one at that, and this felt like a betrayal of his very existence. Yet on another level, would this bring the Suna siblings back into the world? Temari and Kankuro certainly. Perhaps even Garano. The temptation was great. Too great. It was enough to make him sigh, leaving him painfully aware that while Kurura might have no idea what he was really like, Naruto did. She might think him a hero, a bloody savior and such. But he wasn't. Not by any stretch. What kind of knight let his damsel die? This one had. It didn't matter if he walked differently, had a new face, a new body, even an entirely new skillset. Despite all these new trappings at his core, he was still the same person. Still Uzumaki Naruto. Still a failure. I just look different. A stray glance in a nearby puddle reminded him just how different this face really was. It still had the general shape of his visage, but that was it. No whiskers, pale skin. Dark eyes still, the hair only slightly shorter for Kurura's valiant efforts to cut it, those dark bangs certainly belonging to Uchiha Madara. And now he had the Mangekyo Sharingan, which may or may not be eternal. Lovely. Thank God he still had his own voice, or he might have gone star crazy by now. And if he did, Naruto, Pakura was suddenly there, jerking him back to reality with a gentle tug on his sleeve. The gates. Reining himself in, the Uchiha turned just in time to notice that they were in fact swinging open, the welcome landscape of Konohagakure stretching out beyond for miles in either direction. Evidently the sentries had seen fit to allow them passage back into the village, no questions asked. Sometimes it really was good to be known. It was even better to push forward to stride into those empty streets and remain. A few short days ago felt so much longer. No, had been maliciously manhandled by Anbu when he'd come through here with Kushina. Now they snapped off sharp salutes to him, evidently word of his success preceded them. Home sweet home. Jiraiya sighed, spreading his arms as though to welcome a long-lost friend. Man, has it really only been 3 weeks? Feels like we just left. Orochimaru murmured, but he too seemed grateful to be home. I need a shower. Tsunade muttered, lifting an arm and sniffing. I've got sand in all the wrong places. Nawaki gonna give me hell. Forget your kid brother. Let's have a drink. Naruto laughed at that, the familiar feeling of a mission well done momentarily driving away the darkness from his mind. For a moment he felt utterly at ease, completely relaxed in the presence of the soon-to-be alongside Pakura and Kurura. There was a slight awkwardness between those two, but nothing that couldn't be ironed out. Now, all he had to do was keep himself under control until he could sort out the tangled knot he called his heart and decide what his next move would be. Then the Anbu closed in. Names? An Oxfist Anbu, presumably their captain, immediately asked Pakura and Kurura. Pakura, formerly of the Sand. Kurura, also formerly of the Sand. Very good. The Anbu captain nodded, his masked visage reflecting nothing, not even the pretense of satisfaction. We have already been informed of the terms of the treaty. Until space can be made available, you will share quarters with Uchiha Naruto. Is this acceptable? Pakura blinked. Kurura squeaked. The reactions of Tsunade and her teammates were less tame. Why the hell is he that lucky? Bukikuku. You knew about this? I didn't know shit. Naruto snapped, Sharingan flaring in aggravation as he turned himself back to the Anbu. Look, there's no need for that. The reply was curt as it was careless. The law is clear, Uchiha Naruto. Newly instated shinobi must be kept under surveillance at all times until their probationary period is ended. There can be no exceptions. There was a silence between the two men, one in which Naruto was very tempted to fry the rule-abiding shinobi with a well-placed Amaterasu. At last he sighed, Sharingan fading to black once more. I suppose that applies to me as well. There was a murmur of confusion through the ranks, glances were exchanged and words whispered. You weren't informed, sir, the captain asked. Sir? The Kage-sama named you Jonin as of yesterday. The ceremony is tomorrow. Another salute. I for one, look forward to working with you, sir. There was something about that man's tone that genuinely struck him as off. It was far too respectful for a man who, by all rights, outranked him. Bordering on outright deference, even. Only one clan had shown him such blind obedience. You're an Uchiha. It was not a question. There was a moment of silence. Then, yes sir. He didn't drop the salute. My son, Obito, just started in the academy. I speak to him of you often. And I take it you weren't told. Naruto nearly choked on his own spit. He was speaking to Obisho's father. A man he had never met, the very same Uchiha who had fathered the most heinous villain in all of history. Willing himself not to react, he continued to maintain his facade of Uchiha-esque indifference. Something else the old man elected not to mention. He had assigned my squad to watch you at all times while you were within the village. Sir. On what grounds? Naruto was surprised by that one, he didn't think Sarutobi cared that much for his well-being. On the grounds that he fears you might. Lose your temper and burn someone, sir. Half the group Naruto included sweet dropped at that lone remark. Figures. And is that edict still in effect? Nah sir. As a Konoha, you do not require Anbu supervision. But should you ever need assistance, you have to ask for Uchiha Kageyama. Dark brows furrowed in surprise. So the old monkey had been serious after all. There were so many resources laid out before him as a jounin. He almost didn't know what to do with them. But the news that Obito's dad was essentially in service to him. That was something to be remembered. Many thanks for your discretion. I believe the Hokage failed to mention this to me. Is there anything else of which I should be awarded? Any other ceremonies or tasks of monumental importance that I need to tend to? Before the sun rises, if you please. After a pause, the ox Miss Danbu continued, much to Naruto's consternation. Uchiha Mikoto has also requested your presence at your earliest convenience. It's nearly midnight. She was most insistent, sir. Ah. He wasn't about to go into detail about that, not with the company. I'll speak with her tomorrow then. I trust you can be discreet. Yes sir. You won't even notice we're here. I certainly hope not. I intend to get some sleep. When he turned, the man and his squad were gone. Holy shit. He wasn't kidding. What did I say about speaking? Oh no. Something about flaying me with my own spine if I opened my mouth again. I walked right into that, didn't I? Yes. A muscle jumped in Naruto's jaw. Yes you did. And the spine goes. Oh. Okay. I'll be quiet. If you're uncomfortable, the girls can room with me until they find a place of their own. Tsunade suggested, mistaking his pleased grimace for one of actual regret. Ooh, now that I like the sound of wham. One dented head later, and Jiraiya was sorely regretting those words. I didn't mean it like that, you damn perv. I'll take him to the hospital. Orochimaru sighed, grabbing the now insensate shinobi by the scruff of his collar. Thankfully they're open all hours. Please do. Naruto blinked as he watched a pair depart, genuinely touched by Tsunade's earlier non-violent gesture. It would be so easy to pawn the girls off on her for a few nights. Wouldn't it? But no, he couldn't allow himself to be skittish just because Kurura might or might not have feelings for him. He simply didn't have that liberty. Bakura, now that was another matter entirely, at least she knew to rein herself in. Are you sure about this? She asked, drawing him aside. Yeah. Naruto shrugged, what else could he do? It wasn't as though he could just turn Bakura and Kurura away because he didn't feel like dealing with them. It's my fault that they're here in the first place. On a level, I feel responsible for them. A man needs to own up sometimes, you know. Well, shit. He almost jumped when she laughed at him. Keep that attitude up and I'll end up falling for you too. See you in the morning, kid. Naruto grunted as she slugged him the shoulder before departing with the others, muttering something about taking a long cold shower. Try as he might, he couldn't bring himself to shove the last of those words away. Please tell me she was kidding. Right? Right. Oh, now you've got nothing. No point stating the obvious here, partner. What the writer wants. Happens. Don't go breaking the fourth wall on me. I'm in control of my own destiny here. Yeah. Keep telling yourself that. Out. Well, that solved one problem. Sorta. Hopefully. Now he was just left with two. One of whom he had no idea what to do with. Unbidden, he risked a glance at Karado, whom he hadn't said a word since nearly dying of a nosebleed. She didn't deserve the cold shoulder, not after all she'd been through. So. I guess you're getting the grand tour. He huffed. Right this way, then. Naruto-san. Damn, did she have to say his name like that? Stop it. He hissed at his brain, but it wasn't listening, his heart refusing to obey. He needed anything to distract him before he did something he'd regret. Boy, Uchiha. There. Naruto jerked away from Kurura and flung himself around, swinging his head in the direction of the voice, and all the while quietly thanking Kami for timely intervention. There was a roughness in the voice that reminded him of Kiba and, yet, not. The scent, too. It was familiar. His nose never lied. In the end, his suspicions were all but confirmed when he saw the clan markings on her face, the hound that stood proudly beside her. A slow blink was all it took for his mind to process this. Yup. She was an Inuzuka, alright. But who? There was no way that could be Hana, and the only other Inuzuka female he knew who had this scent was Tsume. He almost balked, grateful to see a familiar face on one hand but on the other, just wanting to get the hell away. He didn't trust himself right now. Anger and sorrow and desire were all knotted up inside of him, and the urge to lash and hurt her Takesomian was rapidly becoming too much of a burden to bear. I know the Anbu just gave you the runaround and you're probably, so I'll make this quick. She jerked a thumb over her shoulder. Your girl wants to see ya. Now. Behind him, Bakura bristled. Kurura was less subtle about it. Girl. She whispered. Naruto felt the beginning of a very Uchiha-like scowl forming on his face. And you're telling me why? As I owe the old girl a favor, alright. Tsume. Nothing special about it. Naruto wasn't buying it. And I was kinda curious to see the man everyone's been calling the Black Death. She sniffed, eyeing him up and down. You don't look all that impressive, really. Beside her, Kuromaru barked an affirmative. Black Death. That was news to Naruto. He wasn't aware his actions in Suna had garnered him a moniker of that caliber. Was Iwa to blame for that one? Or was this yet another scheme of the Kazekage? He would not put it past a man to exaggerate his efforts in sauna for his own gain. Still, the Black Death. It did have a nice ring to it. Konoha already had a white fang after all. If in a couple of years, it would have the Sannin and a yellow flash soon thereafter. Not to mention the bloody habanero. Ah, now that brought a smile to his face. Yeah, the Black Death didn't sound so bad after all. Well, you've seen me. He grunted. Now, shoo. I want to get some shut-eye. She moved to block him. Why don't you make Meto guy? The huskiness of her tone proved more than enough to set his already frayed nerves on edge. She was testing him. In that instant a small smile stole over his features. Aggression had always been a part of the Inizuka lifestyle. In all likelihood Tsume was just playing with him, trying to see whether he was as good as the rumors claimed or if it was all just exaggeration. If she kept pushing on his buttons like this, she'd learn there was no exaggeration to his skills whatsoever. But this Tsume wasn't the one who had been tempered by experience, she saw a challenge. Woman, he growled, a bit of Uchiha slipping into his tone, I do not have the patience for this. If anything that seemed to rile her even more. Then do something about it, girls. Naruto's grin wasn't entirely forced this time, why don't you pull up a seat? A blink of the eye was all it took to create a shadow clone. I'm about to show you how Konoha shinobi do battle. It would be good to get some of this thrice damnable anger out of his system anyway, purge the veins and get the blood pumping, you know. Anything was better than the tension arching his spine. Oh, cocky. Tsume grunted, dropping into a crouch. So, you really want to do this? Right.